Hello everyone, I hope you're having a wonderful day. In today's video, we'll dive into a heartfelt story about deep struggles on a lonely road, their painful journey through hunger and despair, and the emotional reunion with James that changes everything. Together, we'll witness how love, family, and the search for belonging can guide us through even the darkest times. If you enjoy this video, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you won't miss the next chapter of this story. Diep's journey begins with hardship on a desolate road, holding only a small amount of money and facing betrayal from a motorbike driver. Alone, hungry, and uncertain of the way forward, Diep is consumed by despair, until James suddenly appears, reuniting with the one he thought he had lost forever. Their emotional embrace rekindles hope, and James promises never to let Diep suffer again. Brought back to James's home, Diep is welcomed with open arms by his mother, who provides comfort, food, and care after days of wandering. Yet, while surrounded by warmth and family, Diep's thoughts remain tied to hockey and the distant farm, stirring questions and unease. During dinner, gratitude and love mix with tension and secrets left unspoken. Though reunited, Diep senses the journey is far from over, with challenges and truth still waiting on the path ahead. Twilight draped the road in a dim, dusty veil, the kind that made everything look lonelier than it really was. Diep stood at the edge, clutching a handful of crumpled bills so tightly that the paper almost tore. Their eyes darted back and forth, scanning every motorbike that zipped past, desperate for a chance. The minutes stretched, and then finally, one rider slowed, his old motorbike coughing as he braked in front of Diep. "Where to?" the driver asked bluntly, his tone more business than kindness. "Construction site?" 300,000 Vietnamese Dong Diep's throat tightened. Their voice trembled, fragile but firm. "I only have just over 100,000. Is that enough?" The driver frowned, his lips curling in annoyance. For a moment, Diep thought he'd drive away. But then, with a sharp nod, he gestured. "Fine. Get on." The motorbike roared to life, the engine's vibration shaking through Diep's bones. The cold wind slapped against their face as the bike sped down the uneven road. Despite the biting chill, a small flicker of hope lit inside Diep's chest. Maybe this ride would finally bring them closer to where they needed to be. But halfway through, the bike slowed to a stop. The driver turned his head sharply, his tone cutting. 100,000 gets you only this far." Diep blinked, stunned. The rush of hope drained instantly, replaced by hot anger. "You said you'd take me all the way to the site," they shouted, their hands gripping the money tighter. The driver smirked, his voice dripping with defiance. "Not for that price. Pay more, or get off." A gust of wind howled down the empty road. Diep's voice cracked, louder this time. "I told you, this is all I have." The driver's expression hardened, cold as stone. "Not enough? Then get off my bike." Helplessness clawed at Diep's chest, but fury burned just as fiercely. They stepped down, fists clenched around the last of their money, eyes blazing with a mix of despair and defiance. The motorbike coughed again, then disappeared into the distance, leaving Diep alone on the desolate road. The road ahead stretched endlessly, blurring into shadow. Not a soul in sight. Just the whisper of the wind and the pounding of their own heartbeat. Diep stood frozen, holding on to those wrinkled bills as if they were the last fragile threads of hope. How will I get home now? The question echoed inside, heavy and bitter. The sky darkened further, the horizon an endless sweep of emptiness. The wind carried a chill that bit through their clothes. Alone, Diep's figure looked small against the vastness, like a drifting leaf caught in a storm, never knowing where it might land. They began to walk, each step dragging, their heart weighed down by exhaustion and memories that refused to fade. And then, Diep! The voice cut through the night like lightning. Diep turned sharply, breath catching in their throat. Standing there, only a few paces away, was James. His eyes were red, his voice breaking with emotion. I thought I'd never see you again. For a moment, Diep couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Tears welled and spilled over, blurring everything. James. The name slipped out like a fragile prayer. They rushed forward, colliding into each other's arms. The embrace was desperate, trembling, as if letting go for even a second would mean losing everything all over again. James's voice cracked, his grip tight. I searched everywhere for you. Diep sobbed against his shoulder, words tumbling out between gasps. They told him about wandering, about the days of hunger, about the ache of being so far from home. James pulled back slightly, his eyes burning with determination. He gripped Diep's hand as though to anchor them. I'm here now, he said firmly. I won't let you suffer anymore. The moonlight bathed them both in a pale glow. Two souls who had been torn apart by fate, finally reunited. Diep felt the warmth of James's hand seeping into their frozen heart, a flame rekindled after too long in the cold. We must be happy, James whispered, his voice trembling but full of hope. Diep nodded, tears falling again, but this time they weren't tears of despair. They were tears of joy. Behind them, the road faded into darkness. Ahead, faintly, there was light, a fragile promise of something better. James led Diep toward his car, his hand never letting go. As the vehicle drove off into the distance, the silent road was left behind, now just a backdrop where fate had decided to work a small miracle. Yet even in James's embrace, as warmth replaced the cold, Diep felt a shadow deep inside, an unease they couldn't quite shake. The night, indifferent and vast, seemed to watch them silently, whispering questions about the future. The car finally pulled up to a small house, golden light spilling from its windows like a beacon in the night. Diep's legs trembled as they stepped inside. Almost instantly, they were wrapped in a tight embrace. James's mother clutched them, her voice breaking with relief. Where did you go? You had us all so worried. Diep bowed their head, guilt heavy in their chest. I missed everyone so much, they whispered, their voice raw. James's mother didn't press further. Instead, she guided Diep inside with the gentle care only a mother could give. She prepared warm water for a bath, laid out clean clothes, and fussed over them as though they were her own child. In the kitchen, the scent of simmering food filled the air. James and his mother bustled back and forth, preparing dishes with quiet urgency. Eat well tonight, she said softly, glancing back at Diep with tender eyes. You've been hungry too long. Diep sat nearby, watching them, the warmth of the home slowly wrapping around them. For the first time in what felt like forever, safety trickled into their veins. The endless days of hunger and drifting seemed like a faraway nightmare. James spoke in a low voice as they worked, When you disappeared, I was terrified. Mom was sick with worry. She wanted only one thing, to have you back. Diep lowered their gaze, tears stinging again. The gentle strokes of James's mother's hand through their hair felt like a cool stream, soothing a parched heart. But deep inside, thoughts of hockey and the distant farm lingered. The memory of it tugged relentlessly. I want to visit hockey, Diep said quietly, the longing thick in their tone. James paused, then nodded with determination. I'll take you. Don't worry. The little house buzzed with the warmth of family, laughter echoing softly against the walls. And yet, within that warmth, Diep felt a quiet void. The days lost could not be erased so easily. Under the lamplight, as they gathered for dinner, Diep's heart beat steadier, wrapped in the comfort of home. But in the shadows of their thoughts, the farm called, along with unanswered questions that still lingered in silence. The warmth of that night was like a fragile shield, guarding them, for now, from the cold grasp of the past. The dining table glowed under the warm lamplight, its surface crowded with bowls of rice, steaming soups, and fragrant dishes. The sound of clinking chopsticks and soft laughter mixed in the air, wrapping the little home in a cocoon of warmth. Diep sat between James and his mother, feeling almost as though they belonged here, as though the weight of the past days was beginning to lift, if only just a little. Across the table sat Lee and Juk, the two men who had helped in the search. Their faces were calm, but the lines of fatigue still showed. James's mother leaned forward, carefully placing more food in Diep's bowl. Eat up, she said gently. You've gotten so thin. Diep smiled faintly, but the sadness that flickered in their eyes was hard to hide. Each bite reminded them not of comfort, but of absence. The absence of hockey, of the farm, of the place where so many memories had been rooted. James raised his glass, his voice steady, but carrying deep gratitude. Thank you both, he said, nodding toward Lee and Juk. Because of you, I found Diep. Lee shook his head, his expression stern but kind. Don't thank me. It's what I had to do. Anyone would have done the same. Diep's hands trembled slightly as they set their chopsticks down. The words that followed cracked in their throat. I walked more than 150 kilometers, hungry, sleepless, not knowing where I was going. Their voice was soft, but the impact fell heavy on the room. For a moment, silence spread across the table. Eyes turned toward Diep, each pair filled with pity and quiet sorrow. Even the air seemed heavier, the weight of their journey pressing down on everyone present. And then, breaking through the silence, Diep spoke again, this time softer, their words laced with longing. I miss hockey. I want to return to the farm. James immediately reached for Diep's hand, squeezing tightly, grounding them. His voice carried quiet reassurance. Tomorrow, I'll take you back. Don't be sad anymore. Diep looked at him, their chest tight with gratitude, though doubt still lingered. James's mother, noticing the shadow in Diep's eyes, reached out to stroke their hair gently, as if smoothing away unseen wounds. But Diep hesitated. The words that pressed against their lips weren't so easily spoken. Finally, in a voice barely above a whisper, they admitted, I heard something about Lee, but I'm scared to say it. All eyes shifted instantly. The tension was sharp, a ripple across the calm of the meal. Lee's brow furrowed, though he didn't speak. James, however, raised his hand quickly, his eyes narrowing with caution. "Not now," he said firmly. "You're back. That's what matters." The unspoken words hung in the air like smoke, invisible but choking. Diep lowered their gaze, silent, their heart pounding against their ribs. The meal continued, but the warmth that had filled the room felt different now. It carried an edge, like laughter layered over unease. The clinking of dishes was steady, yet beneath it, each person seemed to carry their own thoughts, their own secrets. Diep glanced around the table. James's mother's smile was gentle but tight. Lee's eyes, though kind, held a weight Diep couldn't decipher. Juke kept his focus on his food, his silence speaking louder than words. James stayed close, his hand never leaving Diep's. The joy of reunion was there, yes, but it wasn't complete. Shadows lingered, whispering from corners that light couldn't reach. When the meal ended, James leaned close, his voice barely audible. "I won't let you go far again," he whispered. His words were both promise and plea, laced with fear that history might repeat itself. Diep nodded faintly, though inside, their heart churned. They wanted to believe, wanted to rest in the comfort of James's vow. But the memory of the road, the broken promises of strangers, and the pull of the farm were threads tangled together, refusing to let go. As the table cleared, the small house settled into a quieter rhythm. The soft hum of night seeped in through the windows, carrying with it both peace and uncertainty. Diep lingered in the lamplight, watching James and his mother move about the kitchen, listening to the quiet murmur of Lee and Juke as they prepared to leave. For a fleeting moment, Diep allowed themselves to lean back, to breathe in the scent of home-cooked food, to feel the warmth of family surround them. It was a fragile comfort, like glass, something precious but easily shattered. Later, as the others drifted into their own routines, Diep found themselves alone near the small window, staring out into the night. The road stretched beyond the village, dark and unknowable. Somewhere out there was hockey and the farm, and questions that refused to stay silent. James approached quietly, resting a hand on their shoulder. "You're safe now," he murmured. Diep turned to look at him, eyes heavy with both love and doubt. "I hope so," they whispered. James didn't press further. He simply stayed by their side, his presence steady, his silence speaking volumes. The night deepened. Shadows crept longer across the floor. The house quiet, except for the faint creak of the wooden walls and the steady rhythm of breathing. Diep closed their eyes, clutching tightly to the small fragments of warmth they had found here, while bracing for the uncertainties still ahead. Because even in this fragile peace, the road of fate stretched on. Tomorrow, they would return to the farm. Tomorrow, perhaps, they would face the truths that lingered unspoken. For now, in the hush of the night, Diep allowed themselves to rest. But somewhere deep inside, the whisper of the past continued, soft, haunting, and impossible to ignore.